Alexei Navalny has been buried. Now, of course, he died some days ago in a Russian prison. First of all, I really feel I have to say, like I would have to say to any human being that dies, rest in peace. Now, when he died, all the Western political leaders and the Western mainstream media jumped up to praise Navalny. He was a hero. He was such a brave man. He was basically a beacon of hope for democracy in Russia. All of them also strongly condemned Russia and especially Vladimir Putin, of course, for wrongfully imprisoning Navalny. They held him responsible for his death, and they basically suggested that Vladimir Putin had him killed. Now, I came across this article from Scott Ritter on Substack. He talks about Alexei Navalny, he dives a little bit into his past, and he talks about how he came to be the so-called opposition leader in Russia. Now, if you read through the article and also listen to him talk in some videos related to this subject, your opinion about Alexei Navalny might slightly change because Scott Ritter talks about some stuff that the Western mainstream media never talks about because it simply doesn't fit the anti-Russian narrative. Now, of course, here in the West, Navalny was introduced to us as a person who was fighting corruption in Russia, and I do believe there's actually some truth to that. However, first of all, you could wonder if he did it for the right reasons. And second of all, the way he did it, so the methods he used, were very often illegal. So he basically broke the law. Now, consequentially, he was arrested for fraud. And if you dive into the case, it seems pretty legit from the point of view of the Russian government. So for Western politicians and Western media to condemn Russia for arresting Navalny, first of all, it's an internal affair. So a Russian national, a Russian citizen was arrested by the Russian authorities and he was tried by the Russian judicial system. So it's already pretty questionable for the West to meddle in these kinds of internal Russian affairs. And on top of that, again, it seems a pretty legit case. So according to Scott Ritter, Navalny was a criminal. Now, another thing that we don't hear anything about in the Western mainstream media, well, you sometimes hear some hints of it, but nothing more than that, and that is that Navalny was a white Russian nationalist, a racist, and a xenophobe. Now, one example of that, and this is probably the best known example, and that is that he posted a video online where he basically compared Muslims to cockroaches that need to be exterminated. So he seemed to hate Muslims. He didn't like Central Asians. He said the worst things about immigrants. He participated in ultra-nationalist far-right activities. He attended some far-right marches and some other things. He was even kicked out of the party that he was part of at the time for his nationalist views. And even Amnesty International stripped him of a title that they gave him some time prior to that. So it is pretty well established that he was in fact a nationalist and a racist. But again, this is something that you don't hear in the Western mainstream media because it simply doesn't fit the anti-Russian narrative. And the implications of this, let me give you a little example. So I happen to know that in the city of The Hague, there are some people, and I don't know how large this group of people is, but there are some people that are calling for changing the name of a certain street in the city. They want the street to be called the Navalny Street or something like that. Now, I'm pretty sure that these people aren't fully aware of what Navalny actually stood for, because if they would have known, I don't think they would want their street to be called the Navalny Street anymore. I mean, I, for one, wouldn't really feel comfortable if the streets in the city that I live in were named after nationalists and racists. So I believe it's pure ignorance, and it is the result of what we call propaganda. And the irony of it all is that Navalny is admired, apparently also by these people in The Hague, because they think he stood for democracy and freedom. Sure, you mean the kind where Muslims are being exterminated and immigrants are being kicked out of the country? Is that the kind of democracy and freedom you're thinking about? Now, and then Scott Ritter also mentioned something that you also do not hear anything about in the Western mainstream media, and that is that Navalny was collaborating with Western governments. Now, the evidence for this is pretty overwhelming. The organizations that Navalny was part of were funded by the United States government. Of course, the United States government, through the CIA, has a huge reputation for overthrowing governments all over the world. A very good example of that is what they allegedly did in Ukraine, and it seems that now they also tried to do that in Russia. Now, of course, the role for Navalny in all of this was to create unrest in Russia, to destabilize the country, to spread pro-Western propaganda, all to enable the CIA to swoop in and appoint a new puppet leader for Russia to take the place of Vladimir Putin. Now, the risk of this happening in Russia is still not completely gone because the United States government is still funding some of these organizations in Russia, as they are all over the world, by the way. But in this case, the plan failed miserably. But anyway, if this is all true, then I think that we have to conclude that Alexei Navalny was no hero. He was a criminal, he was a nationalist and a racist, and he was a traitor to his country. Now, knowing this, should it be any surprise that the Russian government came down on him so hard? And one last thing, as I mentioned, Western politicians and Western media keep implying, they keep suggesting that Vladimir Putin had him killed, even though nobody knows what happened. I don't know what happened, but what I do know is that there is zero benefit. There was zero benefit for the Russian government and Vladimir Putin that Navalny had actually died at this moment. Think about that. But anyway, all in all, at the end of the day, Alexei Navalny was a human being, just like you, just like me. He played his role on this planet, and however you liked or hated him for it, his role has now been played out. He is dead. So from me, sincerely, Alexei Navalny, rest in peace.